Germany's so-called elite. The Führer's Guard. A black order. The end result is a crime the likes of which the world has never seen. Summer 1945. The war is over. The Allies have put an end to the murders of the SS. Now, they set out to find the perpetrators. They recognize the SS men by the tattooed blood group on their left upper arm. But many have had them surgically removed or have gone into hiding. One of these men is Klaus Barbie, the butcher of Lyon, an SS Hauptsturmführer, actually a minor figure in the SS. But in Lyon, as head of the Gestapo there, he becomes a sadistic murderer. "I have come to kill," Barbie is supposed to have said when he took up his post. Gestapo headquarters in Lyon is the Hotel Terminus. Barbie tortures his victims during interrogation with red-hot pokers, electric shocks, boiling water, and a whole collection of tools that lie on the desk in front of him. The torture often goes on for days. Many of his victims, women and men, die.
Well, everybody knew who some of these people were that were wanted. I mean, you know, including Klaus Barbie. I mean, his name was up the head of the list everywhere.
James Milano works in liberated Europe for the CIC, the US Military Intelligence Service.
We knew that the French were after him. You know, this was common knowledge that everybody was looking for these types of guys, not only Barbie, but top 4 or 5 people on that list.
Klaus Barbie makes contact with former SS comrades in the underground. He commits a robbery with them.
Immediately after 1945, all SS members had to cover up the traces they left behind during the war on the one hand, and on the other hand, of course, they were faced with the challenge of building up a new existence. So it was obvious for many of them that they had to secure mutual help from their own networks.
What remains of the SS after the German defeat? Does the Black Order live on in secret? Thousands of perpetrators and Nazi functionaries leave for the south, crossing the Alps in the direction of Italy. In Rome, the Vatican acquires dubious importance for former SS men who want to build a new existence for themselves. Influential clerics help SS criminals.
One of the most difficult things in the world is to know anything about Vatican intelligence. You can talk all you want to, but I don't think anybody's ever cracked that one.
Rome is a kind of transit hub for fugitive SS veterans. The International Red Cross issues travel documents, actually for Nazi victims who have lost everything. The applicants' details are hardly ever verified. With new travel documents, it's off from Rome to Genoa, and from there by ship to Latin America. Argentina, Bolivia, and Paraguay are happy to accept emigrants with know-how, engineers, entrepreneurs, and Nazis. The US Secret Service also uses this escape route. In the emerging East-West conflict, spies are recruited and smuggled out of Europe. The Americans call the escape routes the rat lines.
We were collecting information about the Russians. And in order to do that, we dealt with Russian deserters. We mounted operations into the Russian zone of Austria and so forth. And then we found that we had a number of these people on our hands and we didn't know what to do with them.
SS murderers like Klaus Barbie are also on the payroll of the US Secret Service. At times he collects information from Augsburg about potential communist agents.
My enemy's enemy is my friend, and so in the end, even a heavily incriminated offender like Barbie finds his way onto American payrolls.
In 1951, this collaboration ends in Germany. Barbie travels via a rat line to South America, to Bolivia.
Barbie doesn't flee of his own accord. It's suggested to him by the Americans, who make it clear that the investigative efforts by the French are so far advanced that they're no longer in a position to protect him. And there was also the danger that American intelligence would be extremely discredited, not least by the East, and gain a reputation for having heavily incriminated war criminals on its payroll.
The Allies had in fact committed themselves to bringing Nazi perpetrators to justice.
Bekenne mich im Sinne der Anklage nicht schuldig.
At the end of 1945, an international military tribunal in Nuremberg begins its first trial against the main perpetrators who are still alive.
Murderers they surely were. Murderers in spades, mass murderers on a scale never before seen in human history. That I knew, otherwise they wouldn't have been there as defendants.
US lawyer Benjamin Ferencz had collected evidence in the concentration camps.
I had been a liberator of many concentration camps as a soldier in the American armies. I had seen the product of mass murder in Buchenwald, in Ebensee, in Mauthausen. I certainly was shocked by that experience. I was traumatized by that experience, which has not left me to this day.
Ernst Kaltenbrunner is also in the dock. The former head of the SS Reich Security Main Office is the highest SS functionary still alive. Kaltenbrunner denies having even heard of the Holocaust.
Ich habe niemals eine Gaskammer, auch nicht in Funktion gesehen. Ich wusste von dem Bestehen einer solchen in Mauthausen niemals etwas. Eine diesbezügliche Bekundung ist restlos falsch.
The biggest disappointment for me as an American, as a soldier, as a prosecutor, was the complete absence of remorse among mass murderers. They never said they were sorry, because they were not sorry. They were sorry they lost the war. They were sorry they were sitting as defendants and that I was still alive, but they were not sorry about anything that they did.
Ernst Kaltenbrunner is sentenced to death, and the SS is officially disbanded and banned.
The problem from the point of view of German society is that there was the catchword victor's justice. Many Germans had distanced themselves and didn't really want to accept what was now being put on trial and disclosed. Instead, they protected themselves from this knowledge, which threatened their own identity by saying, "This is victor's justice." And, as is often the case in war, the victors are always right in the end, and it doesn't have to be the whole truth.
In Nuremberg, more than a dozen SS men are sentenced in further trials, but the vast majority remain unmolested. SS veterans form an organization called HIAC. It is about financial help, legal assistance, and public rehabilitation.
Loyalty actually takes pride of place. above everything else. And in the SS, it was especially important.
Otto Kumm, a general in the Waffen-SS. His division committed serious war crimes.
It is the most important thing of all to me. To have belonged to this unit.
They try to create the myth that they are soldiers just like any other, and thus to facilitate their reintegration.
The HIAG campaigns for SS veterans to be treated in the same way as soldiers of the Wehrmacht when it comes to pensions. As early as the 1950s, this lobbying for perpetrators provoked outrage. Journalists remain hard on the heels of Nazi criminals. One of them is the former senior Reich prosecutor at the People's Court, Ernst Lautz. He was responsible for an estimated 400 applications for the death penalty. After the war, he is sentenced to 10 years in prison, but is released early. Afterwards, he receives the pension of an attorney general for many years. For former members of the SS, Heinrich Himmler's daughter becomes a popular contact point. Gudrun Berwitz, as she is called after her marriage, never renounces Nazi ideology.
There are, after all, quite a large number of wives, daughters and sons of former SS leaders who are trying to protect the historical image of the deeds of their fathers.
Even as a child, Gudrun Himmler is proud to be the daughter of a famous man. The Nazi princess also accompanies her father on his work, for example, when he visits a prison collection center. In July 1941, she travels with Papi, as she affectionately calls him, to Dachau concentration camp. She records this in her diary. Today, we visited the concentration camp in Dachau. We looked at as much as we could. We saw the gardeners, we saw the pear trees, we saw all the pictures that prisoners painted. Wonderful. Afterwards, we had a very good lunch. Himmler's daughter is a star of the right-wing scene and supports former Nazis, with petitions for clemency, money, or help in finding accommodation.
She was almost a kind of mythical figure as Himmler's daughter, certainly among former SS men. And she was largely responsible for an organization called Stille Hilfe, which basically helped them if they were in financial difficulties. But behind the scenes, she was quite significant, for them at least.
Until her death in 2018, Gudrun Berwitz received former SS men as if for an audience, and questioned them strictly about where they had served. In the 1950s, the federal German judiciary has a hard time solving SS crimes. Former Nazis work at many courts, as judges or public prosecutors. There is no central coordination for tracking down criminals or preserving evidence. In 1958, this changes with the Central Office in Ludwigsburg, Baden-Württemberg. It is tasked with investigating Nazi crimes and collecting evidence for preliminary investigations.
When the central office was founded, it wasn't seen as a good thing for the city of Ludwigsburg. In fact, the people there were actually branded traitors to the fatherland and nest foulers. I learned from the files that people also had problems finding rental accommodation if they said they worked at the central office. Even taxi drivers are said to have refused to drive visitors here.
In the mid-1950s, the Hessian Attorney General Fritz Bauer receives a tip-off from Argentina. Adolf Eichmann is said to be living there. The former SS Obersturmbannführer is one of the main perpetrators of the Holocaust. He organized the deportation of millions of European Jews, the logistician of the crime against humanity. Fritz Bauer fears Eichmann might be warned by old comrades in the West German ministries and judicial authorities. He turns to Israel. Secret agents from Mossad set off for Buenos Aires. Eichmann now calls himself Ricardo Clement and works as an electrician in a Daimler-Benz factory. He lives with his family in modest circumstances on the outskirts of Buenos Aires. In his free time, he breeds rabbits. A lower middle-class existence. From time to time, Eichmann meets old comrades and boasts of his deeds.
Von den 10,3 Millionen Juden. 10,3 Millionen Juden getötet. Dann werden befriedigt und würde sagen, gut, wir haben einen Feind, der nicht weg.
The Mossad agents are soon certain. Ricardo Clement is Adolf Eichmann. They plan to strike on May 11th, 1960. Eichmann is kidnapped on his way home in the evening. Mossad men drag him into a car. Argentina's police are kept in the dark. The prisoner is smuggled past the airport checks, disguised as a crew member. An El Al plane flies Eichmann directly from Buenos Aires to Israel. Eichmann is tried in Jerusalem. In the process, the mass murderer presents himself as someone insignificant who is only following orders.
Ich hatte das Unglück, in diese Gräuel verwickelt zu werden. Aber diese Untaten geschahen nicht mit meinem Willen. Mein Wille war nicht, Menschen umzubringen. Der Massenmord ist allein die Schuld der politischen Führer. Meine Schuld ist mein Gehorsam. Die Führerschicht, zu der ich nicht gehörte, hat die Befehle gegeben. Die Untergebenen sind jetzt Opfer. Ich bin ein solches Opfer.
The judges find Adolf Eichmann guilty. He's executed on June 1st, 1962. In the Federal Republic of Germany at the end of 1963 in Frankfurt am Main, Attorney General Fritz Bauer causes a sensation with the first so-called Auschwitz Trial.
That, I think, was very important in bringing the consciousness, the realization of the crimes they'd committed, just as ordinary SS soldiers, guards in the camps in the 1940s.
Auschwitz lag jetzt außerhalb des
Auschwitz was now outside the German Reich, and no one was insisting on the trial going ahead.
Dieses Verfahren aufzuräumen.
Fritz Bauer was different. He wanted it to. And so, he tried to bring the trial to Frankfurt.
Nach Frankfurt zu holen.
The young public prosecutor Gerhard Wiese is part of Fritz Bauer's team that collected incriminating material for years. The accused are 23 former SS men from the Auschwitz concentration camp. Many of them now lead well-to-do lives as dentists, merchants, pharmacists, or restaurateurs. Some police officers salute as the defendants walk past them. During the trial, the men display strong self-confidence, showing no signs of remorse. Gerhard Wiese works on the indictment.
In the beginning, it was really intense. It was murder and manslaughter from morning till night. You also build up your own kind of inner resistance, so as not to let it get too close to you.
One of the accused is Heinz Stark. He apparently had the slogan, "Pity is weakness," hanging above his desk in Auschwitz. Inmate Kazimir Smolin testifies against him at the trial.
He beat the prisoners especially often. We often saw him at the punishment company, there in Block 11, where the prisoners were shot. He was more brutal than the other SS men. I even had the impression that, precisely because he was so young, he wanted to show that he was a fully fledged SS man.
Heinz Stark is 19 when he begins his service in Auschwitz. The high school student takes part in shootings and gassings.
Stark never showed pity. On the contrary, he used to imitate the people pleading for mercy at the ramp. He acted as if it was all some kind of school prank. How could an educated man be so brutal?
Heinz Stark is sentenced under juvenile law, 10 years in prison, 5 of which he serves. In total, the court imposes 6 life sentences. In addition, there are 11 prison sentences ranging from 3.5 to 14 years, and 3 acquittals. The message sent by the Auschwitz trial is more important than the sentences. For the first time since 1945, Jewish victims in Germany are being heard by the general public.
The biggest post-war trial in West Germany was over. It was legally binding and unsatisfactory as far as the sentences were concerned. But that had to be accepted. And now, nobody could actually claim that Auschwitz didn't exist, that there were no gas chambers, and so on. Foolish views that are unfortunately still being propagated today.
The
Auschwitz trial certainly had an enormous significance for the victims, who felt they were finally getting some justice. They were being heard. They realized they could testify as witnesses, and that what they said had relevance.
For the first time since Nuremberg trials, post-war Germans were once again reminded of the Nazis' crimes. Uncomfortable for many people, and a disruption of the mixed repression and relativization that marked the general mood. Trials against Holocaust perpetrators were unpopular. In 1985, Karl Frenzel, SS commander at the Sobibor extermination camp, is indicted before the Hagen Regional Court. About 250,000 people were murdered at the camp. As early as 1940, Karl Frenzel was involved in Aktion T4, the murder of disabled people. In Sobibor, he is noticeably ruthless and brutal. He personally beats and murders people with his bare hands. His neighbors have little understanding for the trial.
Yes, I know him.
Who do you mean?
I have done for quite a while now. I don't want to comment on that. He's a very nice neighbour. I know the story, but do you think a conviction would be in anyone's interest?
What should I say?
Well, what do you think of him?
I don't know. I'm staying out of it.
Out of what?
No idea, really.
You don't know anything?
No, that's the best option.
Everyone makes mistakes. Some make big ones and some small ones.
Yeah, I think old men should be left alone. I mean, there has to be an end to all this. It has to be forgotten at some point.
Karl Frenzel is sentenced to life imprisonment. He is allowed to spend his last years in an old people's home because of poor health. In the GDR, anti-fascism is a matter of state policy. If Nazi crimes are talked about there, then it is about those of others. The fascists are the West Germans.
We're talking about almost 1 million people who belong to the Waffen-SS alone. And of course, a certain percentage of them stayed and settled in the GDR. And they had to be reintegrated because, quite simply, they were needed for building up the new society, including the economy. It was inconceivable to exclude them completely.
In the East, investigations against Nazi criminals lie with the Ministry for State Security, which has assiduously collected files and documents from the Nazi era. No public prosecutor and no scientist has access to them.
They were so secret that until 1991, nobody knew the files even existed. 11 kilometers of files that nobody knew about and that nobody outside the MFS had access to. Even within the MFS, I don't think many people knew that they had this treasure trove of files at their disposal. Whoever had the files had power over the information and could thus act unobserved by the public.
In the GDR, the prosecution of SS perpetrators has to do with the tense balance between secrecy and propaganda in the East-West conflict. Whether charges are brought depends above all on whether it seems politically opportune to do so. In 1983, at a trial in East Berlin, that seems to be the case. It involves the murder of 650 civilians. In 1944, men from the SS division Das Reich round up the inhabitants of the French village of Oradour in the market square. Women and children are locked inside the village church. Afterwards, SS men set fire to the church. The men are herded into barns and shot.
The worst thing is the disappearance of one's family under such circumstances. You have lunch with your family, and in the evening the family's dead. There's no one left. There's no house anymore. There's nothing.
Robert Ebras is one of the few survivors.
It is simply a massacre that was unimaginable in France until then. It very quickly assumes a special significance because the French government, the interim government, decide to make Oradour a village martyr, that is, a symbol of France's suffering under the German occupation.
By chance, the Stasi come across the file of a suspicious GDR citizen. Heinz Bart, SS Obersturmführer, as a platoon leader responsible for the murders at Oradour. He was indicted in 1983.
The Germans also want to show the French that they're punishing these perpetrators even after all these years. And they're on the side of the victims. They simply want to present themselves well to France. They want to strengthen connections, political connections to France, and also emerge as winners in their relationship with France, in this German-French triangular relationship.
The trial against Bart attracts international media interest.
Was machten Sie, als dieses Signal kam?
Dann habe ich gesagt, Gruppe vergangen.
Haben Sie auch geschossen?
Ich habe auch geschossen mit einer MP, mit meiner MP, habe 2 kurze Feuerstöße abgegeben. Ja, Richtung Brust.
Robert Ebras testifies as a witness against Bart.
At Bart's trial in East Berlin in 1983, it became clear to me that he had no regrets. He regretted only one thing, that he couldn't see his grandchildren because he was in prison. But he didn't find a single word for the little children who died in the church in Oradour.
Heinz Bart is sentenced to life imprisonment. The GDR declares that the trial shows how exemplary it is in its prosecution of Nazis. But the Stasi is not telling the whole truth. 2 of Heinz Bart's subordinates also turn up in the secret investigation files. They too were perpetrators at Oradour, but neither has to go to court.
The identification of Bart after more than 30 years in the GDR was already difficult to sell to the public, especially the French public. If 2 more men had been added, there would have been a storm of indignation and outrage.
Nothing should tarnish the self-image of the anti-fascist GDR. West Germany, the 1960s, students demonstrate also against what they regard as the country's overly lenient treatment of its Nazi past. At the CDU party conference in 1968, Beate Klaasfeld, then aged 29, slaps Chancellor and ex-Nazi party member Kurt Georg Kiesinger in the face.
That was a symbolic act, and it was the basis for the actions later on.
In the early 1970s, Beate Klaasfeld tracks down former SS Hauptsturmführer Klaus Barbie in South America. He now calls himself Klaus Altmann and works in Bolivia as a businessman and advisor to the country's military rulers.
There are even studies on this that make it clear that the torture practices used immediately after the coup in Bolivia can be traced back to Klaus Barbie. These really were torture practices that we also see in France. So in that regard, the military dictatorships, in this case Bolivia, made use of this knowledge from former SS functionaries.
In a tape recording, Klaus Barbie tells his SS comrade Karl Wolf about Klaasfeld's efforts.
Berühmte Glasfeld.
Ach ja, die den geohrfeist hat.
Ja, die war hier. Die hat hier mir ein Trubel gemacht. Ja. Sie, die hat sich hier gegenüber meinem Büro an der Kette angeschmiert, an der Bank und hat gesagt, in Bolivien gibt es keine Gerechtigkeit. Die hat meine Auslieferung hier verlangt, haben sie mit faulen Tomaten geschmissen.
Beate Klaasfeld informs a French journalist. But Barbie feels safe. On French television, he denies his identity.
I am not Barbie. As I have already said, I am Klaus Altmann. And the Munich public prosecutor will certainly have the chance to send these documents to the Bolivian authorities.
When a democratically elected government comes to power in Bolivia in 1983, Barbie is arrested and extradited to France.
Barbie expelled from Bolivia to France. I think that is for me, German not Jewish, it is the result of a long fight.
In Lyon, the scene of his crimes, Barbie stands trial in 1987. Beate Klausfeld follows the proceedings.
For me, it was the first time we came into the hall. He was very indignant about having been extradited. And I think he also said, all my problems started when this woman came to La Paz. Yes.
The trial is of national importance for France. Klaus Barbie is sentenced to life imprisonment. He dies in 1991 in prison. For dictators and right-wing extremists, the SS retains its importance even after 1945. Otto Skorzeny, for example, does not have to fear prosecution because he is protected by dictator Franco in Spain. Skorzeny, Hitler's SS-man for special operations.
Im Führerhauptquartier. Der Führer mit dem Befreier des Duce, SS-Hauptsturmführer Skorzeny. Skorzeny wurde für seine kühne Leistung mit dem Ritterkreuz ausgezeichnet und zum SS-Sturmbannführer befördert.
In Madrid, undetected, the SS-man can celebrate the past with like-minded people. From Spain, Skorzeny helps to maintain a network of SS veterans. He is said to be the head of a powerful underground troupe, the organization of former SS members, or Odessa for short. Is the SS continuing its existence underground, gathering its forces for the time of revenge? In the early 1970s, the alleged minutes of a meeting emerge. A secret Odessa meeting with about 100 men. In the end, the story turns out to be a myth.
There was, de facto, a network of former SS functionaries who also cooperated, acted and communicated across different countries. But this large-scale Odessa organization never existed.
Riga, in Latvia. In the Baltic states, once oppressed by the Soviet army, the SS still has many admirers today. Here, SS veterans who fought against the Soviets celebrate every year on March 16th. A reinterpretation of history? Nazis as heroes because they fought communists? After the German invasion of Latvia in 1941, 160,000 Latvians entered German service. Most of them fight in the Waffen-SS voluntarily. They too swear allegiance to Hitler. Latvian SS men participate in the Holocaust and commit war crimes. In Riga, Latvian and German Jews are harassed in the ghetto. In 1941, around 30,000 are murdered in just 2 days. Latvians wearing SS uniforms are among the perpetrators. At the annual commemoration ceremonies, this is of no importance. Alongside the elderly veterans, the younger generation also marches. Right-wing extremist youths, side by side with former SS men.
They allow anybody to celebrate and commemorate the war if they fought against the Soviet Union. Of course, many of those who fought against the Soviet Union were, in fact, Nazis or SS divisions, Latvian SS division. Now, I think the problem with this is, although the Soviet Union occupied these countries, partly Russianized them, treated them unfairly, suppressed local elites, and of course, at least in Stalin's time, had a reign of terror. This is not the same as the Nazi plans for these areas. The Nazis' general plan for the East envisaged 50 to 85% of the people of these countries being exterminated, and you cannot say that of the Soviet Union. So I think it's a misapprehension about history and about the past.
But how can the legacy of the SS be dealt with? In the spring of 1985, the Wittenberg military cemetery made headlines. 2,000 fallen soldiers of the Second World War are buried here, including 49 Waffen-SS men. US President Ronald Reagan and Chancellor Helmut Kohl want to honor the victims here together. The planned visit triggers weeks of public controversy in the US. Holocaust survivors and Jewish associations call on the SS president not to go to Wittenberg.
Mr. President, don't go to Wittenberg. To forgive and forget, to sanitize the Nazis of their crimes, to wipe clean the butcher's bay and go. Thank you very much.
The president is unimpressed. On May 5th, 1985, he and Kohl visit the Kolmershöhe military cemetery, together with two former World War II generals. 40 years after the end of the Second World War, the intention is to send a worldwide sign of reconciliation from Wittenberg. But the dead SS men prevent that.
The visit to Wittenberg showed that at least people in the West, and in Germany too, didn't understand what it was all about. The moment you bring in members of the Waffen-SS who are buried there, just like ordinary soldiers, it means that something has gone wrong here. Something went wrong with both Kohl and Reagan, and it was good that people protested against these things.
Many Waffen-SS soldiers are not personally involved in crimes, but the uniform they wear stands for terror and for the murder of millions. Former membership of the SS is becoming more and more of a burden in democratic Germany. The subject is often either talked down or avoided altogether. Hans Martin Schleyer, president of the Employers Association, joined the SS in 1933 as a Hauptsturmführer. He was murdered by left-wing terrorists in 1977. Actor Horst Tappert. His past in the SS only became known after his death. Nobel Prize winner Günter Grass only admits to his membership in the Waffen-SS in his late 70s. He is allowed to keep his Nobel Prize. Actor Hardy Krüger was also drafted into the Waffen-SS in March 1945 at the age of 16. Cannon fodder for the last days of the war. Just like thousands of others in the Wehrmacht, Volkssturm or Waffen-SS. The central office in Ludwigsburg examines the extent to which SS men were personally guilty. This still leads to legal proceedings against people who are now very elderly.
I certainly don't think the investigations against Nazi perpetrators are wrong. I think they're still necessary in terms of history and legal history. I think it was an urgently needed step that these sentences passed over the last 10 years were passed at all.
After the turn of the millennium, the central office also sets its sights on a Ukrainian who emigrated to the USA after the war. John Demjanjuk is said to have been a supervisor in the Sobibor extermination camp in 1943 as part of the so-called travniki, prisoners of war who performed guard duty and auxiliary work for the SS. The central office in Ludwigsburg accuses Demjanjuk of having participated in the murder of at least 29,000 people. In 2009, the now 89-year-old is found guilty by the Munich Regional Court for being an accessory to murder, a novelty in legal history.
Anyone who served in an extermination camp or in a concentration camp in which systematic extermination took place, who was on general duty, was guilty of what happened, even if they did not kill directly. Guilty of being an accessory to murder. That is a factor that could probably not have been presented in that way 40 or 50 years ago in the Federal Republic.
After the Demjanjuk verdict, trials are possible against all SS members who were on duty in the camps. Small cogs in the murder machinery. Today, senior citizens, many without insight or remorse.
Was erwarten Sie von diesem Prozess?
Freispruch oder was? Ich weiß es nicht.
Between 1945 and 2005, almost 14,000 Nazi perpetrators stand trial in West Germany. About half of them are found guilty and mostly given prison sentences of between 6 months and 1 year.
We had heard less from the circles of those affected, of the victims, about it being absolutely necessary to enforce the sentence, but it is important that the criminal law is recognized. We are not an ungracious state. We do not prosecute anyone who can no longer stand trial or who's no longer capable of defending himself. This gets investigated very closely. There is no exemption from punishment once you are 90 years old.
Some old SS veterans are still celebrating today. Right-wing extremist parties like Der Dritte Weg pay homage to them as contemporary witnesses. Here, they have a ready audience for their historical views.
The flow of history remains, even with the lost war, and I maintain that the problems have remained almost the same, and that the Second World War is not yet over.
Suddenly, eyewitness evenings with former SS people can now take place. And the internet transports that. That means they're becoming visible again, and their views are spreading. The trivialization and even the denial of the Holocaust are visible once again due to people who give themselves a certain voice. A special voice, because they say, I was there.
Yesterday's right-wing extremists as role models for the right-wing extremists of today. The Sword and Shield Festival in Ostritz, Saxony. Sword and Shield, SS for short. The security service for the festival is provided by the group Arische Bruderschaft. T-shirts feature a logo of 2 crossed hand grenades, the emblem of the SS Sturmbrigade Dirlewanger, notorious for numerous war crimes. Symbols banned in Germany are plastered over.
Wir sind die Jungs aus der Reichshauptstadt und wir spielen White Power Rock'n'Roll! Wir lieben unser Land, aber wir hassen diesen Staat. Jeder wird ihn auch auf der Welt. Unsere Saal und das ist seine Sache.
Hier ist eine geistige...
There's a spiritual infiltration going on here that can be described as fruitful.
Und insofern bin ich natürlich für die jungen Leute.
And in that respect, I am, of course, already a credible representative for the young people, as a member of the life generation and as one who's never made cheap concessions to the zeitgeist.
Right-wing rock festivals are considered fertile locations for recruitment. For example, for the Azov Regiment, paramilitary volunteer battalion, ultra-nationalist, which fights against pro-Russian separatists in the Ukraine conflict. In 2017, there are said to be 2,500 mercenaries in its ranks, including Germans. The sign of recognition is a wolf trap symbol, like the SS dispositional troop once wore. A special troop of the US Marines also seem to have few qualms. The Scout Snipers use the SS double runes as an unofficial emblem.
When other nations use the symbols of the Nazis, stupidity knows no bounds.
The SS show what people are capable of, the deepest abyss in German history.
The SS are seen as the core of the Nazi regime, or so it seems in the culture of remembrance. But there always has to be a warning here. If we merely look back on the memory of the SS, we ignore the fact that a whole people cooperated with the SS, with this part of National Socialism.
The deadly lie of the battle of the races leads to the crime against humanity. The SS sees itself as an elite. In truth, it is an instrument of mass murder, a historical disgrace.